Hey everyone, welcome to Christ Culture and Coffee. I'm your host Robbie Lashua, and I'm here with my amazing co-host Tyler Hurley. How you doing, Tyler?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks, Robbie. I think you're pretty amazing yourself too.
Oh,
So,
stop it. Get out of here. What are you sucking up for? Just kidding. Dude,
I,
it's good to see
I
you.
mean, I don't know. Just here we go. But cool. We are super excited about this episode today because we're going to get more in depth on textual criticism and
Yeah.
manuscript evidence.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is
there's
going to be
so much.
fun. This
Yeah,
one
yeah.
this
Super
episode's
excited.
a little more technical than normal. You know what I mean? It's kind of it's a little bit more in-depth and nerdy, but I think our listeners are going to enjoy it. So, hey, I do want to mention this too.
Yes.
If you're watching, so Tyler and I again aren't together in person. We're doing this over the internet, and the reason for it is I shared last week how I'd been sick. Turns out my wife and I had the coronavirus. So there it is. It actually
Yeah.
happened. We actually had it, and so we've been quarantined. And the nice thing is we're both feeling great, so we just praise the Lord for that. But my quarantine's actually up on Friday, so a few more days here, and I'll be back on the streets. Can't wait to get it back out in
Yeah, I'm
person
sure. That's
with, oh man, it's been a long time I've been in here. So anyway, just wanted to let people know that that's what's going on, and that's why we're filming like this. But we still wanted to do the show, even though I've got issues and I had COVID, and I'm glad it's over, and I've got
yeah.
some antibodies now, so that's nice.
Yeah, and you've been really a trooper sticking through it, especially like just through the past couple weeks with being sick and everything. You've still been able to do the podcast. So props to you, Robbie. Well done.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, I felt pretty good on the days we've been recording, so that's
That's a
been
good
great.
thing.
But
Yeah.
well, let's get into it today. So, Tyler, this is Christ Culture and Coffee. We love to start with a coffee tip, and this coffee tip that you
Yeah.
have for us today, this is coffee snobbery at its finest. I mean, this is
Oh,
getting
yeah.
into the details of making good coffee. So, why don't you tell us what the coffee tip is for today?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head when you're saying this is very coffee snob type because this is something like so precise. But the coffee tip we have for you today is to ensure a great cup of coffee, you need to take into account your brew ratio. I'll say that
Brew
again. It's
ratio.
Yeah, the ratio of your coffee to water. That's what we're talking about when we say brew ratio.
Okay, I like
So
it.
to ensure precision, you need to buy a countertop scale for your kitchen, and you need to weigh the coffee grounds and the water. You need to weigh them, not just measure them, Robbie.
Wait,
You need
wait,
to
wait. Hold on, hold
actually,
on. Weigh them.
yes, like on a food scale, you need to weigh them.
Okay.
And now, in order to do that, so the thing is the reason you do this to weigh them instead of measuring. Let's say you use tablespoons to measure your coffee, right?
Okay.
Well, the problem is that's inaccurate because depending on how coarse or fine the grind is, you'll have a certain volume of coffee that will change depending on that type of grind.
Oh, that
So
makes sense.
weighing
So
it,
yeah, so it's not one tablespoon can differ from another tablespoon depending on the grind or the bean
of
or
course
anything
it
like
can.
that.
Of course it
That
can
makes
because
sense.
of the
Okay.
different, yeah, exactly what you said. The
Yeah.
different kind of beans, the way you grind it, all of that takes into account, which we've talked plenty of times on this show.
Sure.
However, this is more about the ratio of the actual grounds you have to water. And
Okay.
so by weighing it, clearly what we have here through research is most professionals use a ratio of 115 to 117 coffee to water volume. So 1 gram of coffee for every 15 to 17 grams of water, which is
Okay.
for every 8-ounce cup, which is 237 grams, you need 14, 16 grams of coffee.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So, okay, so let me make sure I got this straight. So,
Yes.
the ratio to use is 1 gram of coffee for every 15 to 17 grams of water.
Yes,
Okay, so
exactly.
now I'm doing math in order to make coffee, Tyler.
Right. Yeah. Yes, but apparently the experts that are out there, the professionals
Uh-huh.
who make coffee out there, say that this is the best brew ratio
Okay.
to take into account of how good your coffee tastes.
Well, hey, I'll give it a shot. I need to get one of those scales though, so I can start weighing
I
out
know.
the
Well, it
water
makes
and the
sense.
coffee.
Just yeah. Because if you think about it, everything comes into account when you're making your coffee. Like the amount of water you use. If you use too much, it could become a little more diluted, or if you
Yeah,
use too little, not it's too strong. So you got kind of have to have a balance of what you're going for with
it
your
makes
coffee.
sense, man. No, it makes sense. Yeah, and to be precise like that, so you can have consistency over time. Yeah, that's a good tip. I like that.
It does. It does. So But anyways, that's your coffee tip for the day to all you coffee snobs out there. So it's very, very important, I guess, according to these experts, that you weigh your grounds and your water.
I like it, man. Good
Now,
tip.
you are very welcome. Now, let's get into the content for today because I'm super excited about this.
Yeah, this is pretty fun stuff. So, like, just to preface
Yeah.
it, so what we're talking about today, because we're in a series on New Testament reliability. And so, what we're going to be talking about today is how do we know what the original New Testament said? Like, that is the goal. How do we know that what we have in our Bibles today is the same thing that the Apostle Paul wrote and the Apostle Peter wrote? How do we know that we actually even have the New Testament? And so today we're just going to get super nerdy and we're going to talk about how do scholars go about ascertaining, that's a big word, ascertaining what the New Testament actually originally said, and do we know what it said? So here we go. I'm excited about this.
Yes, yes. And so first and foremost, we want to start off with the information that's interesting that a lot of people out there don't know. We do not have the original autograph, meaning the actual tangible handwritten documents of the New Testament.
What are you talking about? We don't have like what Paul wrote?
We have it, of course, but we have copies of copies. We don't have the physical piece of parchment or papyri or whatever Paul actually wrote on for the New Testament documents. And that goes for all books. We only have copies of copies. Now, a lot of people look at that and they think that that's a problem, right? Because you think, well, of course, like, why wouldn't you want to have the original, what the actual author did? Because someone could have messed with it, right?
Sure.
But the fact is, we have so many copies, so many manuscripts. In fact, we have, and this is an estimated around 5,100 to 5,300 Greek New Testament manuscripts. And the Greek ones are important because the original autographs, the original handwritten parchments were written in Greek. However, you may have caught right there, I said 5,100 to 5,300. Now that's a range of 200 manuscripts.
Yep.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah. So Robbie, tell us, why can't we be more precise? Why is there such a big gap of how many manuscripts that we talk about here?
Well, this is interesting, Tyler, because in a lot of apologetics books that I've read over the years and that you've read, you know, they're given like the exact number, as if we could even know the exact number. Recent scholarship has come out and talked about how we should probably, to be more accurate, give a range and not try to be exact, because when we try to be exact, that number becomes obsolete. There's a few reasons for it. They're discovering new manuscripts all the time. And so new manuscripts come out and they kind of add to the old number. But it's also hard to be precise. And I want to give a couple of reasons why. So when people are looking at the Greek New Testament manuscripts, there are 4 different categories of manuscripts. There are what are called majuscules, what are called minuscules, what are called papyri, and what are called lectionaries, okay? Those are like the 4 categories of the Greek manuscripts. And I want to explain to you what each of those are. So majuscules are the earliest type of Greek writing that are used in the Greek manuscripts we have. And this type of writing is all capital letters with no spaces in between words and hardly any punctuation at all. So this is interesting. Could you imagine reading a book in English that's all capital letters, that there's no spacing between, right? That's what the majuscules manuscripts are. And there's a lot of reasons for why they did this. One of the reasons was you could save on parchment because you only had a certain length of scroll. And so by cramming it all together, you could fit a lot in there. And this was just a style that they wrote. It was a handwriting style. Capital letters, no spaces. Now, minuscules are different handwriting. They're in small letters, and they're more cursive-like. So it's not capital, all smushed together. It's different. The majority of Greek manuscripts that we have are minuscules, but the minuscule style didn't really start appearing until the 9th century AD. So that's interesting. Papyri, these are manuscripts that are made with papyrus. They're written on papyrus. So this is actually where we get our word paper from. is papyri. What papyrus is it's a reed plant that grows abundantly in Egypt, and they cut thin strips of papyrus, and then they lay strips in two layers. They lay it down flat, like in a horizontal and then vertical layers, and they let it dry out. And then they beat it down and they press it and they let it dry and they smooth it out, and it becomes like a flat sheet of paper almost, right? It's made of reeds, but it's similar. It's similar to paper. It's super strong and it's very, very durable in dry climates. And so they would take these sheets of papyri after they had processed them, and then they'd glue them together, and you could make scrolls out of papyrus. So we have a lot of papyri that we found in Egypt and other arid climates that have New Testament Greek writings on them. But the papyri is about the type of material they're written on. And then the fourth category are lectionaries, and lectionaries are Greek manuscripts that are arranged in sections of scripture that are to be read in public worship service. So it's almost like an aid that you'd have at church, right? To read, hey, today we're all reading this, and people would get it out and they would read from it. So now here's the thing, Tyler. There's these four different types of Greek manuscripts. Do you notice a problem with these four categories? This is really interesting, right? The problem is two of them are based on a handwriting style. One of them is based on what material it's made out of, and then one of them is based on the content and the arrangement of the content. So this is a problem for us, right?
There we go. You can see these categories kind of overlap each other, right?
Exactly, man. That's a huge point. Yeah, so there's like some papyri, which is they're made out of papyrus, right?
Yes.
We didn't talk about what the handwriting style is on some papyri. Well, some of them are majuscules, right? So do you count it as papyri or do you count it as majuscule? Do you see the problem?
Yeah, which one is it? That's a very important question when it comes to counting these.
It is, man. And even with like lectionaries, like some lectionaries are majuscule, some lectionaries are minuscule. So do you count it as a lectionary or do you count it as minuscule? Like,
yeah, that's right.
So it gets really interesting when you get into the details of how they count these. And are we double counting things? Another way that sometimes stuff gets double counted is that there's manuscripts that have been disassembled and sold in pieces to different buyers around the world, right? So it's really difficult to know if some manuscripts are actually part of another manuscript. Right? So sometimes a manuscript could get counted twice. Like if I found like a codex, a book of Greek New Testament writings, and I was like, I want to make a lot of money off this. So I sell one sheet to you and one sheet to a guy in Africa and one sheet to a guy in Europe. You basically could count those as three different manuscripts, but they're not. They're all one manuscript. It's just you don't know. So sometimes we count things twice because of issues like that. And then in addition to that, some manuscripts have been lost accidentally. There's like records of a certain manuscript, and then the libraries that house them can't find it anymore. And so there's like pictures of lost manuscripts. It's like, I don't know where it went. So that happens. But also sometimes people steal the manuscripts because they have like tremendous religious experience, right? Or because they have like monetary value. And so there have been times where people have stolen manuscripts and then resold them, and they get counted as a new manuscript, which they shouldn't have because we already counted them. So to say, hey, here's the precise exact number of New Testament manuscripts we have is really a bad idea because of all these factors. But within that, it's safe to say we have somewhere between 5,100 to 5,300 Greek New Testament manuscripts.
Right.
Does that make sense?
All, yeah, of course it does. And that's important to remember because what's interesting about this is all these manuscripts are not necessarily equal to each other either. Like, kind of
that's a big point.
Yeah, like some of them contain the entire New Testament, like, for example, the Codex Sinaiticus, where it literally documents the entire New Testament, that we have that. But then there are other that are just fragments that only have one or two words on them, like the John Ryland Papyri or P52 document, which is literally like just a couple inches long, and it's got just a couple words on it.
Yeah, I think it's two. I think the exact measurements are it's about 2 inches by 3 inches. So, and it has some of the Gospel of John on the front and the back. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so it's like, but that's still a manuscript, but
Yeah,
they
that little
each
credit
count.
card size is a manuscript, and then the whole book of the New Testament is those are each counted as a manuscript.
Yeah, it's counted as just one. So it's like you have some that are, but then again, you have some that are older than others, even though they contain less. So it provides more credibility. So you have to take all these things into account. And so it's important we realize that we don't count manuscripts just on their numerical value, but instead weigh the evidence that we find contained in the manuscripts.
That's a huge point, Tyler, because a lot of, again, with apologetics, a lot of people like act like because we have a certain number, it means it's true. It doesn't.
Yes.
And just for the fact of having a certain number doesn't even mean we can know what it says. We have to look at how good the manuscripts are and weigh the evidence that's inside of them, right? And so I think that that's a huge point, bro, is all manuscripts are not created equal, right? Some of them are
Yes.
great
Yes.
pieces of evidence and some of them contain a few words that are nice, but really how helpful is it, you know? So
Yeah,
that's an
exactly.
important thing to think about when we're trying to figure out what did the original New Testament say.
Yes, and so what's important in noting all of that we just said is to it kind of help you understand textual criticism methods, and we're going to get into that a little bit right now. So
Yes.
in order to attempt to get to the original text, like what the actual autographed, handwritten documents had said, New Testament textual criticism has developed methods of comparing the manuscripts with one another and concluding on what the original said. So, an
Mm-hmm.
example, they're taking, like we said, the P52, like the little John fragment, the little words that they get from that, and they see that it's older than like we said, the Codex Sinaiticus. So they can compare and see, okay, well, we've had those words from John way longer than we've had it here, so we can
Mm-hmm.
believe that it's more credible, right?
Yeah, that's what
So
they do. And they kind of even will take like, so they'll take all of the, let's say like John 18, because they've actually done this. Every
yeah,
single piece of John 18 that we've ever found in Greek New Testament manuscripts, they have compared them all with one another to see where
yes.
our differences and how the differences come about. And so they're attempting to figure out what was the original that all these copies have been copied from and copied from copies of.
Right. That's
Yeah.
so important to know. And so that's kind of what we're trying to get into with all this. It's there are many different differences within these Greek manuscripts, and but these differences are called textual variants,
Yeah, textual
right?
variants are big because when we start to compare all of these, bro, there's differences. And so
Yes.
they actually keep track of the variants of the differences because we need to find out which one's wrong and which one is right.
Yes, exactly. And that's important to know because I don't want to be believing in a lie, right? And that's what the whole goal of this podcast is in general, too. We're trying to expose the truth, not just in the secular world, but also in the biblical world. And we're trying to apply apologetics to scripture and show that the variance actually helps us understand the truth, what was actually written, like I said, the handwritten autograph documents. And so with that, it is safe to say that there are around 500,000, and again, that's 500,000, 500,000 text variants among our New Testament Greek manuscripts, not including spelling differences.
That's huge,
Now,
right? That sounds like a lot,
yeah,
man.
it's huge. It does, and it should. And some people get intimidated by that or scared because it's like, wow, like so many variances. And we're going to get into those and what they're actually about. But Bart Ehrman, and I know we've talked about him quite a bit on this show. He's a non-Christian atheist, kind of agnostic-leaning atheist
Mm-hmm.
who kind of provides some evidence for scripture. And he's a New Testament scholar. And so what he points out is that there are only about 138,020 words in the New Testament, which is insane because that means that there are 500,000 textual variances to the actual words that are in the New Testament, meaning we have so much more variance than the actual context of the words
Yeah,
in
that's
the
kind
New
of a
Testament. Does
problem,
that make
right? There's
sense?
more variants than there are words in the New Testament. And he's I've
Exactly.
heard him say this in like
Yeah.
debates before and in his books. Yeah, he loves talking about that. Like it's
Yeah.
supposed to
So
scare us
it,
or something.
Yeah, exactly. And well, it does to some people when you first look at that at face value. And so, but what's important to note about that is how scholars go about text criticism. That's how we
Yes.
need to look at this thing.
Yep. So
And
let's dive
so,
into that, Tyler. Let's talk about, okay,
yeah,
so we got all these manuscripts. We're trying to compare them with one another, and we see that there's differences and variation with words and word order and all this stuff. How do we go about, what are some general rules that textual critical scholars use to determine what the original said?
yes, yes. So, some of those rules that we have, one is to determine the reading that would most likely give rise to others. Uh,
Yep.
and with that, it's just understanding, like through the reading, what would most likely make the most sense, right, with what they're reading. It's like when you're analyzing the text, like what does it say, right?
Yes, yeah. There's an example of that, and we'll talk
Yeah,
about this in detail next week. But an example of that would be in First John. I think it's chapter 5. I should know this, but I think in First John 5, there's like this textual variant that talks about there's three: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and it's like a Trinity term. It's Trinity, a
yes.
Trinity formulation. Well, we don't find that in a lot of other manuscripts, and it isn't original. It got added later, but they'll determine why would this get added? Would it get subtracted, or would this type of a thing get added? And it makes more sense that it would get added because people are trying to clarify the Trinity versus,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to actually take that out of the Bible. Scribes wouldn't do that, right? So the most likely reading would be that they added this definition to bolster the doctrine of the Trinity, which
Yes. Thank you
originally
for
wasn't
explaining
there.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely like that is exactly what that is. And so next, what they do is they take the more distinctive reading, and they usually prefer that over another. Meaning, like when you read something that has more detail or something that is a little bit more distinctive and like specific, they'll pick that out of one that's less specific, less detailed oriented.
Yeah,
And
because
then
the general idea with that is that a scribe, because the people who are hand copying these care about the New Testament. That's the only reason they're doing it, right?
oh yeah,
And so they're
right.
not going to make things less distinctive, right? That would be to take away from scripture. They wouldn't do
Oh, of
that.
course it would.
Yeah, so it makes sense that they wouldn't take away from distinctiveness, but they would more often try to clarify it. And so if it's more distinct, that's usually the preferred reading because they would probably simplify it, not complicate it. It's a
Yes,
good general
exactly.
rule. And all these are general rules. Sometimes some of them don't work when you're comparing things in certain texts, and you have to say, okay, this one doesn't apply here because of this, this, and this. But these are the general rules that they
Right.
use when determining it. Yep.
Yeah, exactly, and that's perfect. And then another factor that they take into consideration is which of the readings that they're comparing is shorter. And typically, not in all cases, but they will favor the shorter reading because if it's more concise and more to the point, they want that to be the one that goes through into the text criticism.
Yep.
Just it makes more sense because it's more specific. Like we said, distinct, specific, and more on topic and context. That's what they're looking for. Short and
Yeah.
simple, right?
Yeah, and the idea there is that a scribe who believes that the Bible is the word of God wouldn't take away God's word, but they'd probably be more prone to add to it to clarify things.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so also another one factor that they take into consideration is they also determine which reading is more appropriate in its context. So
Mm-hmm.
meaning what they'll look at the literary context based on the passages around it. They're going to look for grammatical uses and phrases, and then they'll also look for spelling errors and historical context
Yeah,
even
yeah. So if you
into
think about
play.
that one's pretty easy because like if somebody's
Yeah,
writing to like if Paul's writing to the church and he's writing
right.
like and he's using all these plural wording and verbiage, and then it all of a sudden switches to like third person or something. It's weird in the context,
Yes,
and they can
right.
see, oh, that's probably a mistake because it could be this, and this version says we still, but this one changed it to something else, and so all of those factors come into it. But that's what's nice about all of this is when we're comparing it with all the different manuscripts. It's not like we just have one manuscript. We compare all of
Right.
them, and we can see, oh man, a whole bunch of them have this reading, reading. These ones have this reading. We can think through the time period and see when this mistake derived. Like you can see it happening with a lot of them. So kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yes, and that's exactly what they do. And so with that too, they also examine, just like you said, parallel passages for any differences, and they determine why they may appear. And that just kind of, that last one is kind of a general oversight of all of text criticism, because really that's what they're doing the entire time. They're taking these parallel passages, ones that are the same, they're similar, and they're comparing to see what differences are there. And they're saying, okay, should we add or remove things from the biblical text here based off of these manuscripts? And that's kind of what they're doing. That's all that text criticism is. It's comparing documents, looking for mistakes, things that were included that weren't, and they're just kind of editing it down and trying to clear out any error, any human error that may be getting in the way of the actual text and the message that was behind it.
Yep, that's right, man. And some of these mistakes that we see happen are unintentional changes to the text. We also see intentional changes where scribes add stuff, but we also have like a whole list of unintentional changes. And we can't talk about every single detail of text criticism on the show, but we did want to share some of these unintentional changes, which are really interesting. So a few of them that happen so often that they have categories for these are things like mistaken letters. So sometimes in the text, there's similar looking letters that are sometimes interchanged for other letters, especially when you're using the majuscule manuscripts, the capital letters, right? Some of them look similar, and you could see how a scribe would accidentally write the wrong one because it looks similar to something else. You know, for like us, like if you're writing a V and a W, the capitals, they look pretty much the same, right? It's just in English, it's just one stroke different. And so M and an N, one stroke different. And so sometimes there's words like that have been changed because they made a mistake of similar looking letters. There's another unintentional change category that's called homophony. And this is substitution of similar sounding words. So this is really interesting, and it's difficult to explain on a podcast without diagrams and showing people pictures and all this stuff. But in Romans 5:1, we have this happening. So Paul uses the word echomen, which means we have, but it also sounds just like this other word, echomen, that means let us have or we may have. And there's only one Greek letter different between those two, and it's what type of an O in English, what type of an O you're using. Echomen, echomen. They sound very similar, but there's one letter different. That means there is a different, it has a different meaning of what the word is. Either we have or let us have, we may have. So this kind of thing happens where, and I could see myself doing that. You know, you read it, you say it in your head, and then you go to write it, and you write what it sounds like versus the exact wording of what it is.
Yeah, right. And well, not only that, though, but you got to think, too, something that a lot of scholars were probably dealing with at the time is when you're looking at these manuscripts, some of them are a little older, a little worn. Maybe as like one of those letters is not as easy to tell if you're looking at like an O versus an E or like a U, or you know what I mean? Like something like that.
Yeah, there's all those types of things that can happen. And it is crazy too, because we even see like some manuscripts, scribes write in the margins, like they write notes or they write theology or they write extra stuff. And then like a generation or two later, we see those notes work their way into the text. So it's really a funny science to do text criticism like this. So that's, substitution of similar sounding words. Another one is called hypography, and this is an omission of a letter or a word, and it's usually due to a similar letter or word in the context. So you see a word that ends the same, your eyes kind of skip over it, and you don't get the next word that has the same ending, and so you omit a letter of a word or a similar letter in a word or context. Another thing is called didography, and this one's easy to remember because it's like ditto, right? Like two. So when there's a letter or a word that's been written twice rather than once. And we actually have an example of this possibly happening in Mark chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. And you have that, right, Tyler? You're going to read that for us?
Yeah. It says, and he appointed the 12 so that they could be with him and he could send them out to preach and to have the authority to cast out demons. And he appointed the 12 Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter.
Yeah, and then it goes on to name the other disciples. But do you see how in verse 14 it says, and he appointed the 12, and then in verse 16 it says, and he appointed the 12?
Yes, I see that.
This may be a example of didography where the scribe was writing down things and he accidentally wrote the same phrase 2 times. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that. Yeah, I've done that when reading before. You ever do that? Like
Yeah.
you're reading it one line and then you try to go down, but your eyes do a little like skip and you end up going back and starting over the same line again.
Yep, exactly.
I've done that before, or vice versa. And so that makes total sense. Like, of course that would happen.
Yep, exactly. So that's didography. There's another one that's called metathesis or metathesis, and
Right.
it is the reversal in order of 2 letters or words. So that one is interesting too. So when there's 2 of the same letter in a word, sometimes they get omitted or they get reversed. And so an example of this is in John 1:42 when it's talking about Simon Peter, and it calls him Simon, son of John. Well,
Right.
It says John, but some manuscripts have omitted one of the N's from the Greek word John, which makes it into Jonah.
Right.
And so that's a difference, right? So again, nothing huge, but when you omit 2 letters next to each other, because John has 2 N's next to it in that verse, and then you change it for 1, it means something different.
Right.
There's another unintentional mistake called fusion, which is where there's incorrect word division that results in 2 words joined as one. So Mark 10:40 has an example of this, and in Greek the word is al and ois, which means but for whom. When you separate them, al, ois, right? But for whom. But if you conjoin them and you smush them together, it's alois, which means for others. So it means something different. And you can imagine when they were writing in the majuscules, which you remember are the capital letters all smushed together with no spaces, the scribes have to make a judgment call on where the word ends and the new one begins. And so that's where we have some issue with these words getting smushed together or separated, not at the right spot.
Yeah, well, like you said earlier too, Robbie, when we were talking about the way that the text was written, a lot of them, because of the limited amount of space they would have on a scroll sometimes, is there wouldn't be any spaces. It would all be written together, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's exactly why you would have that. I could completely understand why someone would have an issue of separating some words if there's no space between it all.
Yeah, exactly. That would happen in English if we did that. We could see it as a couple of different words. So
yeah, exactly. It makes complete sense.
Yep. So that is interesting. Another thing that so that's fusion. That's when there's incorrect word division that results in 2 words getting smushed together as one. And then the opposite of that is fission, which is an incorrect word division that results in 1 word written as 2. So we see this in Romans 7:14, where the word should be oidamen, which is we know. But if you split it into 2 words, it can be oida men, which means on the one hand I know. So that makes a difference. It should be we know because the context of what Paul's talking about and how he's been talking in Romans 7. It is we know. Plus, I don't think he uses the on the one hand and then later on the other hand. And so the on the one hand doesn't make sense in that passage. So that's an interesting one. And then there is another one that I wanted to mention, last one, and it's called homoioteluton. 6-syllable word.
Yeah,
homoioteluton. Yep. Which in Greek it means a like ending. So this is when there is an omission of words because there are 2 words that are the same or 2 phrases that are the same on both sides of the word or phrase. Okay, so if I said something like, I went to my house and at my house, so there's house and house, right?
Right.
So sometimes you're reading that along, I went to my house, and then you write house, and then you look back up and you see the second house, and you just start from that house, and you omit the and at my that's in between house and house.
Right. Yeah.
That is what this is, okay? So an example of this is in 1 John 2:23. It has the phrase "has the Father" in it twice, and it should have that in there. But sometimes there is the mistake of omitting the words that are in between the "has the Father" and "has the Father." And so we see that happen in 1 John 2:23, where
Right.
some mistakenly omit that and don't repeat it twice because their eyes kind of skipped over it and they just recorded the second "has the Father" or the ton patera eke. So it's really interesting. So again, hyper super nerdy geeky stuff, but this is how you do text criticism. You get into the nitty gritty of the passages and you say, okay, what was the original reading? What are the
Yeah.
rules? What mistakes have been made? And how can we come to the original text that is available if we synthesize and we compare and we do the science of text criticism?
Yeah, exactly. And then now the importance of textual variants is very important to know. Like the fact is these should not cause us alarm.
Well, but
Like
Tyler, there's 500,000 of them. That sounds like a lot, right?
yeah, right, right. Well, that's the thing. Like at first that scares you, like, and that's fine. It, like seeing that number, that like that's okay that shakes you up. But the thing is it should not cause you alarm. The reason why is because the fact that we have so many manuscripts with so many variants also means that we have a lot of data with which to look out to work out the variant readings. Meaning, like we can look through those 500,000 variants with the manuscripts we have now. We can compare it and see like we have the right manuscripts. Like we have the original intended message. But
Yep.
like
Well,
basically what we're
the fact that we can recognize the variants means we can recognize what's not a variant.
exactly, yeah. And with the variants, we can figure out most probably what the original said. Like
Yeah,
that
so
is
even
such
with the variants, that's exactly right. Even with them, we can do this text criticism thing to come to what the original must have said.
yeah, of course. Like obviously, say you had like a bunch of just random letters that you had sent from your grandma, right?
Mm-hmm.
You made copies of it or something that you kept cherished. But like if you notice that there's differences from all of them, and you're comparing it like to any letter in English or something, you can see differences today that would compare, and maybe they'd be wrong, but you could compare them together and you could see what the original context said. They did the same thing with Greek,
Yep.
and they're going through it now, like to get us the text that we have today in the New Testament. So by looking at the variants, looking at the errors or the things that are like different in each of these manuscripts and comparing, we can see what the original text said. And that's why it's so important that we have all these variants, because they tell us what the truth of what we have right now. And it also, I think it attests to the accuracy overall of the New Testament.
Yeah, it really does, man. And the other thing is this: a lot of the variants don't matter.
Right, they don't. Yeah.
They are so unimportant, easy to recognize. Like for instance, like here's an example. So if you were doing text criticism with a recipe that your great grandma had passed down, right? Let's say it's some recipe for like sourdough bread or something, and you know it comes from 3 or 4 generations back, and then your grandma has like a handwritten copy of it, and your great aunt, you know, your grandma's sister has a handwritten copy of it, and then your great uncle has a handwritten copy of it, and one of them got smudged because they accidentally spilled some water on it when they were doing some dishes, and then your parents have copies of it, and your aunts and uncles all have copies of it, and your great aunt's kids have all these copies of it, and there's all these copies of the same recipe. Well, the one that has a word smudged out can easily be figured out what that word should have been by looking at the other ones that have that word in them, right?
Yes, yes, exactly.
And even if some punk kid, let's say yourself, went and you changed the recipe, and instead of it having, you know, baking soda in it, you changed it to yeast just to mess it up or something, you know, even if you intentionally changed it, we could go and compare it with the other ones and we could figure out, oh no, originally it must have said this because 10 out of the 11 say this, and this one has a red marker through it and it's scratched off, right? We could figure that out.
Yeah, right.
That's what's going on with the New Testament. And so a lot of the variants are so insignificant, they're unimportant, that even in New Testament Greek textual critical studies, they don't even bring them up because they're so easy to spot and they're trivial and they don't make any sort of difference for what the original had said because we can spot what it didn't say. Peter Gurry, he's at Phoenix Seminary, he's doing a lot of great work in text criticism. He makes this really important percentage. So I don't have time to explain it all. If you want to read a great book on this kind of stuff, it's this book right here, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, which was edited by Elijah Hickson and Peter Gurry, who's at Phoenix Seminary. And they've done some really cool work on talking about how many of the variants are important, right? And he says, through some like kind of groundbreaking calculations, that the number of variants that might be meaningful affect the translation of the Bible is somewhere between 0.3% to 2.8%.
Right.
So think about that. 0.3 to 2.8% of the 500,000 variants are even somewhat significant.
Yeah,
so now all variants aren't created equal, right? We have to weigh the variants just like we weigh the manuscripts to see how significant they are. Most of the variants are trivial and don't change anything and don't matter, and we know what the wrong ones are. But among the 0.3 to 2.8% that are somewhat important, we even need to look at those ones and see, okay, these ones are significant in the sense that they're not easy just to throw out as unoriginal. But even among these ones that are important, which ones actually may affect doctrine or ethical living in the text, and which ones really are trivial and don't affect the meaning of the text. So even among the small percentage that are significant, we even get a smaller percentage that make a difference when it comes to understanding Scripture.
Yeah, so many do not affect the meaning of the text at all. Like that's crazy when you look at that comparison. Because, however, the thing is, we want to dig deeper into these variants because they help us resolve like text criticism issues that do have an effect and meaning on the text and doctrines in Christianity. But again, like that's such a small percentage. It's crazy how it really the New Testament that we have today isn't really that affected by all the variants.
Yeah, it's not affected at all. Not at all. It's not affected very much. And this is where we want to make a distinction, because a lot of times in the past, apologists would say the variants don't matter because they're so insignificant. What percentage of them matters? However, there are some variants that matter. And we want to look at those, and we want to, like you said, we want to do good text criticism to figure out what does this probably originally say, and what bearing does it have on certain doctrines or certain beliefs. And so we don't want to just, because it's a small percentage, throw those out. No, they're kind of significant, so we do want to look at them. I want to read a quote from Peter Gurry. This is just a great quote. He says, "It is best to admit that in relatively rare cases, variants really do have some bearing on doctrines and ethical practices of the Christian faith. But none of these doctrines or ethical practices is established from these disputed texts." So what he's saying is there are some variants that are significant that change the text in such a way that what it is saying, it doesn't mean the same thing. However, we're not building our doctrine based on one verse and one variant for pretty much any doctrine, right? Like we don't say, oh, the Trinity is based on only one verse. No, it's not. It's a whole bunch of verses, right? Jesus' deity isn't based on one verse. It's based on a whole bunch. That's why it is a doctrine. So the variant may change the meaning of the text in some places, which we'll look at next week. But we don't build doctrine based on one verse or one variant. So when it's all said and done, and this is what I think is mind-blowing, Tyler.
Right.
When we've synthesized all of the text we have and we have done text criticism on it, our modern Greek New Testament, after all text criticism is done, gives us a 99% accurate reading of what the original autographs said. Now, this does not mean that some variants are not important, but it does mean that we can rest assured that we have an accurately transmitted New Testament from the time of the apostles up till the modern day. And I think that is just amazing.
Yes, yes, that's so huge. Like it's very important to note that, and that was the whole goal of this topic for today was to just show you guys that the New Testament is reliable because of text criticism, and that's what this whole series has been through. Like we can just see through text criticism that the New Testament is reliable. We have enough data to compile what the original handwritten autograph said to 99% accuracy, and it's super cool that we have all of this.
And let's make sure we're distinct with this.
Yes.
Just because we can know that we have what they wrote doesn't mean what they wrote is true. So when you say it's reliable, you mean that it's reliably transmitted. We have what they wrote. It could all be a bunch of fairy tales and lies. But you can't say that we don't even have what they wrote. Some people like to say that, right? We don't even know what the Apostle Paul wrote because it's been translated through so many generations and iterations. That's wrong. You know what? We know what it says, and reliably, we know what it says. Now, is it true? Well, that's a different thing, right? And so we figure that out with different methods.
Too. Yeah, that's something we need to make a distinction of too, is like the difference between transmitted and translated. Like those are different things, like which we've described before on the show. But when something's transmitted, it's directly copied word for word exactly what it's saying from one to another. Translated is changing from a language entirely and trying to have to figure out a different wording for something.
Yeah, a lot of people like on pop like a common objection to this is it's been translated from Greek into Latin, into Coptic, into English, into Spanish, into Chinese. It's been translated so many times you can't know what it originally said. Like what you said is so true. They're mistaking transmission for translation. Transmission means it's been passed along through time accurately. And it has, because we go back to the Greek and we do text criticism and we transmit it, and then we translate it from the Greek into Chinese, or the Greek into English, or the Greek into Spanish. So people do mistake that all the time. They say it's been translated so many times, but what they're really talking about is transmitted, and we need to make that distinction and then show them it has been transmitted accurately and it's reliable. We have, 99% accuracy. We have what they wrote originally, and you can't dispute that. That's the crazy thing to me. The science is so good. It's indisputable that's the case. 99% accurate reading of what the original authors wrote, which it just gives me confidence that, man, it seems like somebody's behind this, giving us this accurate depiction through the work of text scholarship and obviously through the Greek manuscripts that are preserved for us to investigate. It seems like God wanted us to be able to know what they originally wrote.
Yeah, and that's super great and exciting. But thank you for joining us today on Christ Culture and Coffee and being a part of the podcast. Make sure you tune in with us next week, though, because we are going to be looking into some of the most difficult variants in the New Testament and see what kind of bearing they have on Christianity.
Yeah, that's going to be fun, man, because some of the I don't want to mess people up, but we got to be accurate with what's original and what got added that might not be, and what are the difficult passages. So that's going to be really fun next week.
Yeah, we're super excited, so make sure you join us for that. Also, make sure if you aren't already that you go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're coming out with new content on there weekly, so make sure you come and be a part of that. And also, we're going to be making posts on our social media accounts all the time. For those of you who might not know, we have a Twitter account now, so go ahead and follow us, Christ Culture Coffee. And on Twitter, Instagram, and we're also on Facebook. So make sure you go and join us on all of our social media platforms and YouTube. Subscribe to stay up to date on everything that we're doing. So thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of the podcast with us today. We will see you next week as we talk about text variants.